What if your destiny wasn't yours to choose? What if your every breath, your every burden, your very mind were shaped not by ambition, but by ancestry? In the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, hidden between the quiet trees of Odd, West Virginia, lives a woman the world never knew it needed to see. Her name is Betty Whittaker. She does not speak often. She never sought attention. And yet, without her, an entire family, twisted by generations of consanguinity, cloaked in mystery, feared and pitied in equal measure, would have long collapsed into the dust. Betty didn't ask for this life. She was born into it. Born into a house with no electricity, no running water, no heat beyond the breath of bodies crowded together in the cold. She was born into a family where the names on the family tree loop back on themselves, where silence is more common than speech, where barking is more common than laughter. She came into the world as just another child, one of 15, but fate had a different plan for her. When others were broken, Betty remained whole. While her brothers screamed at invisible ghosts or wandered barefoot through the mud, Betty quietly wiped their faces, cooked their food, learned to translate their growls into needs. Her mother, Gracie, once whispered to her, not as a wish, but as a command sealed in desperation, "Don't ever leave them." And Betty never did. She became more than a sister. She became the heartbeat. In a world where blood ties became shackles, Betty turned her chains into purpose. And so begins the story of a woman who chose not freedom, but family, who was bound by blood and lived for them all. Betty Ann Whitaker was born not into a town, but into a hush, into a place so remote that even the wind seemed to forget its name. Odd, West Virginia. A village tucked into the aching folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the roads end in dirt and the mail only comes when someone remembers. In that cradle of silence, Betty took her first breath in 1952. Her home was not a house, but a structure stitched together from old boards, rusted metal, and the refusal to fall. No plumbing, no power. Just the creak of wood under too many feet and the warmth of breath passed between siblings in a single shared room. She was the daughter of John and Gracie Whittaker, a miner and a homemaker, though the titles meant little. What defined them more than labor or love was blood. Not in the way it connects, but in the way it coils. John and Gracie weren't just husband and wife. They were double first cousins. Their mothers were sisters. Their fathers were identical twins. The tree that bore them didn't branch. It bent back upon itself. In Betty's veins flowed a lineage so condensed, so collapsed, that scientists might call it a genetic bottleneck. To her, it was just family. She was the 8th of 15 children. One more mouth in a house that already echoed with noise and need. She arrived in the middle of the line and in time became its spine. Odd wasn't just a name, it was a verdict. The Whitakers lived as if the world beyond the trees had never existed. They rarely went to town. They didn't send their children to school. What passed for life was survival, and what passed for family was a clan so intertwined that no one could say where one ended and another began. And in the center of this tightly bound world, quietly learning, quietly watching, stood a girl named Betty, already bearing more than a child should, already tethered to a future she did not choose, forged by a past no one had the courage to undo. Betty grew up in a world without windows to the outside. Her childhood was framed not by chalkboards or fairy tales, but by the relentless rhythm of survival. There were no toys in the Whittaker home, no books lining shelves, no bedtime stories whispered in the dark. Just the hum of insects in summer, the groan of old wood under winter snow, and the ever-present chorus of her siblings' confused cries. The house, if it could be called that, was less a home than a shelter, cobbled together from old trailers and salvage. It held 15 children, 2 parents, and the ghosts of unmet potential. The floors were cold, the air damp. There were no beds for everyone, only mattresses that spilled onto the floor, bodies stacked like firewood, sharing warmth when the generator sputtered out. Bathing happened in a shack out back, where old tires and scrap wood became walls, and water trickled from a tank when the power would permit. They drew from a well, cooked on propane stoves and washed in tin basins. In winter, the wind pushed through cracks like a thief. In summer, the stench of poverty settled in the corners of every room. Neighbors whispered about the Whitakers, called them strange, cursed, wrong, but few ever knocked on their door. Fewer still ever stepped inside. In this environment, Betty didn't just grow, she adapted. From as early as 5, she was changing diapers, stirring pots, calming the howls of her younger brothers. She learned to read her siblings' needs without words, because most of them never found their voices. Some barked, some grunted, and she understood every sound like a second language. There was no school bell for Betty, no recess, no friends. The outside world passed her by like a river she could hear but never touch. Her world was her family, and her role was caretaker long before she was even a teenager. Where most children dream of what they'll become, Betty already was something essential. Her hands were too small for the work they did, but they did it all the same, because there was no one else. There never had been. The death came first in whispers, a cough that wouldn't go away, eyes that stayed closed too long, the kind of sickness that never saw a doctor, never got a name. In December of 1980, Betty lost her mother, Gracie. 2 years later, her father, John, followed. No one came. No social worker knocked. No relative stepped in. No state official paused long enough to ask, who's caring for the children? Because by then, the children were already grown, at least in years, some well into their 20s. But inside that sagging home in odd West Virginia lived adults with the minds of infants. Men who barked instead of spoke. Women who didn't understand what death meant, only that Mama wasn't coming back. In that absence, something ancient stirred in Betty. She did not weep in public. She did not scream. She simply stepped forward, quietly, entirely, as if her mother's dying breath had passed not into the wind, but directly into her daughter's lungs. She was 30 years old and had never lived a life of her own. There was no ceremony, no announcement. One morning, she just began cooking every meal, sorting every pill, calming every storm. When Ray shrieked and kicked, it was Betty who took the blow. When Larry needed help tying his shoes, it was Betty who bent down again and again. When the bills came, those few they actually received, Betty squinted at the numbers and paid with what little they had. No one told her to do it, but long before her mother died, Betty had made a silent promise. I won't leave them. She couldn't. Not when half of them couldn't tell day from night, couldn't read labels, couldn't find their way to the bathroom unaided. She didn't just love them. She was them. Their limbs, their memory, their map to the world. The town barely noticed. The state certainly didn't. But deep in the hollow, a woman became a fortress. Decades passed. The walls of the house leaned further. The floorboards softened with rot. But inside, Betty stood like a beam that never cracked. She didn't marry. She didn't leave. She didn't complain. She simply carried them, each day, each need, each silent scream. And in doing so, Betty became more than a sister. She became the rhythm that kept them all alive, the heartbeat of the family, unseen, unthanked, but utterly irreplaceable. The Whitaker family tree isn't a tree at all. It's a knot, a twisted cord of bloodlines tied too tightly for too long. In its branches, the same names echo, generation after generation. Twin brothers fathered children who married each other. Cousins born with the same 4 grandparents. Marriages not of love or chance, but of habit, of ritual, of geographic and mental enclosure. Betty's parents, John and Gracie, were double first cousins. Their parents were siblings twice over. Their blood, identical in places where variation should have thrived. And from this entanglement came 15 children, each one a roll of the genetic dice on a rigged table. Some never spoke, some never understood. Some blinked at the world like it was too bright, too loud, too incomprehensible to bear. But Betty emerged from the same broken formula and remained whole. Why? No one can say for certain. Maybe it was the random mercy of recessive genes. Maybe she inherited just enough clarity to remain upright while her brothers curled inward. Doctors might call it luck. Betty never would. She never flaunted it, never used it to separate herself from them. Instead, she bore it like a responsibility. She cooked, she cleaned, she wiped mouths and tended to old wounds. She understood Ray's grunts, Larry's confusion, Kenneth's fragility. She became their interpreter, their nurse, their world. And yet, inside her, somewhere beyond the duty, was the quiet ache of the unspoken question. Why me? Why was I spared the silence? Why did I survive the maze of our blood when so many didn't? She never asked it aloud. She turned the guilt into fuel, into service, into purpose. Some might have escaped the hollow. She never even tried. Because being born whole in a family that wasn't, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like obligation. And Betty embraced it with every breath she had. Betty Whittaker has never had a husband, never held hands on a front porch swing, never slipped on a ring or whispered promises in candlelight. No one ever asked for her heart, because her hands were always too full. She has never had children of her own, yet she has raised more than most mothers could bear. Larry, Ray, Kenneth, her brothers in name, but sons in responsibility. She fed them, bathed them, shielded them from a world too cruel to care. For decades, her arms have cradled the fragile and the forgotten. There were no weekends away, no quiet mornings. Every hour belonged to someone else. She never had a job, not the kind with paychecks and clock-ins, but her work was unceasing. Cooking, cleaning, managing government checks so thin they snapped under the weight of winter bills. Every dollar was stretched, every decision measured by need, not want. And when the world finally noticed, when cameras came rolling up the gravel path, they found a woman with no complaints, no regrets voiced, no list of lost dreams. But loss was there, behind her eyes. Not loud, not angry, just there. What would she have been if not the matriarch of America's most inbred family? A teacher? A mother with children of her own? A woman with laughter lines instead of the tired creases of worry? She'll never say, because Betty doesn't speak of what could have been. She only lives in what must be. No one sees the weight she carries. They see the tattered home. They see Ray barking at the wind. They see Larry smiling, confused, grateful. But they do not see what it cost Betty to hold this world together. She wakes before the others stir, her bones stiff with age, her breath shallow in the morning cold. She makes coffee with shaking hands, not for herself, but because Ray will scream if it's not there. She counts pills in silence, double-checks names, prays the old fridge holds one more day. And still, she never asks for help. For 40 years, her life has revolved around people who cannot survive without her, who need her to speak for them, to bathe them, to calm them when shadows move across the walls. She is their calendar, their doctor, their cook, their shield. A woman in her 70s carrying the weight of 6 adults frozen in childhood. There is no rest, no retirement, even when donations began arriving, even when the cameras came and went. Nothing really changed inside Betty. She still scrubbed, still stitched, still bore the quiet panic. What happens when I can't anymore? She doesn't voice it, but it follows her, this fear. Not of death, but of what her death would mean. Ray wandering into traffic. Larry tricked again. the roof leaking, the food running out. That's what haunts her. Not pain, not poverty, but absence. Because for the Whitakers, Betty's absence would not feel like loss. It would feel like apocalypse.